the other thing I've learned is everybody adapts at a different rate. Some people get it quite quickly. Some people are nervous about change. So explaining the goals, and just, making them feel part of the journey, I think is really important. I mean, I think people underestimate how much, industrial espionage goes on. A few years ago, I was working for a small business, and people were trying to hack us. Every business has got valuable data. If you're not running on one of those OSs, you're going to be falling behind, because it takes a lot of money to develop hardware and OSs and user experience and keep up with new features. I think we're going to see more align with one of those OSs.
Yeah.
Look how smartphones started. They started for voice calls. Now we use them for everything else but voice calls.
Totally, yeah.
So, and I think we're going to see, lots more use cases as there's more users. So,
yeah. Welcome to Immersive Futures, brought to you by 4.0, where we explore the exciting world of immersive technology with industry leaders and innovators. And I'm your host, Martin Makinson. Today I'm joined by John Dabill. John's impressive career spans immersive technology, IoT and telecoms. His impactful work with HTC and more recently VIVERSE, where he contributed to the development of immersive technology platforms on a global scale. John's a recognised leader in scaling operations, driving innovation and building teams that deliver real results. In this episode, we'll dive into his journey in immersive tech, explore current trends and discuss what's next for John as he moves to a new chapter. We'll also tackle leadership challenges, the future of immersive experiences, and the critical topic of ethics. So without further ado, let's get started.
Morning, Martin. Thanks for the introduction.
So let's start at the beginning. How did your career in immersive technology begin, and what motivated you to pursue this field?
Yeah, so it's an interesting one, because I spent all of my career in technology since university, initially starting in telecoms, and I'd spent a long time there in various telecoms roles. So, with roles in smartphone and BlackBerry. So when it came to looking for something new in 2019, I was looking for, a similarly challenging sector as telecoms had been when I started. And I'd been sort of following the VR journey really since around 2016 with, Zuckerberg's big presentation at the Samsung Unpacked event. Saw this role at HTC, which was written for me, and the rest was history. So I stepped into a EMEA product leadership role at HTC in early 2020.
So it sounds like quite an exciting journey, particularly, I guess, with the, your time at BlackBerry as well, when I guess kind of BlackBerry were kind of ruling the waves, and everybody was on kind of BBM and that sort of thing at the time.
Yeah, I mean, when I started with BlackBerry, it was a firm that most people haven't heard of. I was in the telecom sector, and I heard about it by accident.
Yeah,
and massive growth, massive decline, and you learn a lot, I think, through those periods. But I was, pleased I made the move when I did. I've always wanted roles that are challenging, and you can, drive out that growth. And as we'll come on to, immersive tech is definitely that. Yeah,
most definitely. I mean, kind of looking back throughout your career, has there been a significant kind of project or decision that has kind of influenced how you approach leadership today?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of examples there. So there was one decision that I took very early on in my career, and it was one of those, it's advice I've given to people since: never volunteer for anything until you know what you're volunteering for. That was out of this. So I was working at Ericsson at the time, so I'd only been with the company a couple of years, just out of training. And in a team meeting in the UK, they wanted a volunteer to go on a 2-week project. So anyway, long story short, that 2-week business trip to Athens ended up being 4 years working around Europe. And as I say, I didn't really know what I was getting into when I volunteered, but it was great because it was like a startup environment under Ericsson structure at the time. The office in Greece, there was probably only about 4 of us in the early days. So we did, literally everything. I was the technical person in the country. So anything product technical support wise fell to me or my colleague, but we were rotating around between us. So it was a really good experience in terms of how business worked, everything from recruiting, managing premises, supporting customers.
Yeah.
Um, and then following on for that, that sort of first international role gave me a little bit more confidence. So again, I volunteered for a project. I knew a little bit more about what I was getting into this time. And at the risk of showing my age, this was a project that was developing 3G mobile networks. So that was a real proper indoctrination into leadership. I was still in my
Mm.
20s. I had a team of around 30 staff. It was doing everything from building the trial networks, testing, running it. We were the team that actually built the first 3G mobile network in the UK and made the first,
Blimey, right.
with Vodafone, the first 3G mobile call in the UK just outside Newbury. So, through those, it was just, it was sort of a baptism of fire in some way, taking on large teams and people that were, much older than me at the time. But, I think you learn a lot through those situations.
Yeah. And how did you cope, I guess, or what we've experienced, like, I guess, kind of managing teams that were, kind of significantly older than you? I mean, what was the kind of, I guess, kind of, potential barriers that you had there?
Yeah, well, as I say, I mean, I looked after everything from the installation side of the business in the telecoms world. It used to be poles and holes because things would either go
Yeah.
on poles up in the sky or down underground. And that was a world that I hadn't really had exposure to. And the guy leading that, Jimmy was in his 40s at the time, a Glaswegian with a broad accent. So you can imagine initially when he found he was reporting to me in my 20s, there was maybe a little bit of friction there. But I think navigating through that, I sort of, listened to him, understand him. We worked out, what my role was, what his role was. He knew what he was doing on the work, and my role really was there to support him with the business and to give him the overall direction in terms of priorities. And we became good friends and colleagues through that.
Nice. So across the industries that you've worked in then, what's the one core lesson that's consistently guided you through major changes?
Yeah, it's interesting. And people have asked me in the past actually, because I think some people have a real, target for their career from day one, perhaps, 5 or 10 years. I've always had a target, from what I want to do, as I said at the beginning, things that are challenging,
Mm.
where I believe I can make a difference. But I think in my career path, it's sort of been a little bit more fluid, and I've
Mm.
taken or spotted opportunities when they came up. The move to BlackBerry, at the time I was working with Motorola, which was a well-established, telecoms business, and I actually found out about BlackBerry, which I hadn't heard of, through one of our customers, and I thought that sounds interesting, and sort of targeted that. So I can't speak for other sectors, but the tech sector is always in constant change. Yeah, it's everything:
Yeah.
the people, the technology, the businesses. So I think I learned pretty early on to embrace the change and encourage it, and take those challenges. And I've often seen that when I've started with new companies, people say, why do we need to change? And I always think, this phrase, we've always done it this way, is a reason to change things, not a reason to remain the same. Because
Totally.
in tech, if you're not changing, your competition are, and you're going to lose ground and fall behind very quickly. So I think it's those challenges and embrace the change that have been, my clear guiding factors, and makes you pretty robust,
Mm.
with changes that happen in the sector. Then.
So kind of segueing very nicely, I guess, so, kind of talking about change and to kind of moving into immersive tech, obviously the industry is evolving rapidly and, it seems like there's a kind of a new development kind of coming to market on a pretty frequent basis. What trends do you see as being the most transformative for businesses right now?
Yeah, I think there's a few areas we could talk about. I mean, the obvious one, I think that the foundation, if you like, on VR has been, enterprise apps for training and development. We know a lot of companies are already using this for simulation, things like training in hazardous environments, process optimization, human to human processes. Essentially kinetic learning, learning by doing, which is proven to add benefits from a VR perspective.
Yep.
I think there that the principle's clear. It is proven. and it's much easier and much more scalable to do in the real world. I think, from what I'm seeing in my role, I work with a lot of customers from around the world, mostly across Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And I think in Europe, we're in a little bit of a danger of falling behind from some businesses. Training is absolutely essential in a business, not just when people come on board and you're training them with what you do, but keeping people updated with new training technology, retraining people if there's errors.
Mm.
And I'm still seeing businesses saying, prove how
Mm.
XR training works, when there is a lot of data out there already on the effectiveness. And the irony is often those businesses can't prove the effectiveness of their current training
Yes.
regime. So
Yeah.
you're not comparing apples with apples. Um,
I think
and I,
as you've already touched on before, though. Sorry, about the kind of we've always done it this way. I think there's a real, you see it none more so in immersive tech, don't you? I think with companies where they're so kind of rigid in terms of their kind of thought processes of how there's almost to some extent a fear of kind of embracing the technology, really, even though, like you say, they're proven, the ROI is proven.
yeah, exactly. And it's not change for change's sake, but where it's improvement, where it's been proven rather, you don't need to jump in, with both feet. Trial it for
Mm.
sure, but build that plan. And I think, other excuses, cost of hardware, robustness of solutions that, have been seen as a barrier in the past for businesses. I think those have been getting less and less. And I think
Yeah.
the danger for Europe is we are seeing very active, government strategies from elsewhere in the world, government and business strategies with money pouring in, especially in the Middle East, aggressively pushing these new technologies and these new solutions. And there will end up being a skills gap, I think, if we're not careful. So yeah.
Yeah. Are there any, based on kind of what you're, kind of what you're seeing on a global scale? I mean, are there any specific industries, you believe are kind of setting the or setting the standard, sorry, for immersive tech adoption? And what do you think that other industries can kind of learn from their success?
Yeah, so I think again, there's several areas, but if we focus on a couple of those, I think one area I was going to talk about as well is that I've been focused on a lot recently is digital twins and spatial collaboration. Not only these days can businesses like architects or people that produce large products like aeroplanes or trains can show their customers in high quality from anywhere in the world. But it's making the design process much easier, much quicker, much more iterative. But then with the addition of AI, which I'm sure we'll come on to today, and IoT, you get more into that realm of interactive digital twins, and then you've really got the power to transform how systems operate and are run on an ongoing basis. Again, in the Middle East, we're seeing that with projects like the Neon projects,
Yeah.
the Line and Sindala and those. And coming back to the industries, I think again there's an obvious one. Healthcare I think has been a long time user of VR. Again, I'm not sure the penetration is really where it should be these days because there's this concern on, again, I think cost on accreditation and safety and things like that as well. Um, and it's not always in the obvious areas on healthcare. Back in the pandemic, we were working on a project that was supporting new nurses and doctors with training in giving bad news to patients in VR. That's not the sort of
Okay.
thing that
Yeah.
you want to do first time in the real world. And during the pandemic, they lost that ability to shadow other people, which was their primary training mechanism
Yeah.
at the time. And then we're seeing, VR being used, to help patients with anxiety, to keep them distracted while there's medical procedures going on, or to, get them into a virtual outside world if they're a bit more bedridden.
Mm.
So, I'm working with a not-for-profit at the moment that's looking at how the metaverse can help reduce isolation in an elder audience. So I think there's lots of areas in that medical field that are already being used, and many more that we could explore as well.
Yeah. Are there any lessons there then, do you think that, particularly around healthcare, that, if you look at more, I guess, kind of traditional industries that, that they could kind of take any learns or any kind of lessons from them? And then I guess, because like you say, I guess from a, healthcare point of view, I guess the use cases are now starting to become more broader, aren't they? From the point of view of training surgeons and, like you say, kind of, people with, dementia or, kind of, or and other kind of healthcare challenges. Do you think that there's other, I guess, any lessons there? Yeah, that I guess, yeah, for argument's sake, I don't know, kind of aerospace or automotive or something like that could kind of learn from.
Yeah, it's interesting. There was always an example I gave. I think, early businesses like the automotive sector, as you say, who were early adopters. I think they took VR for that one specific purpose initially,
Yeah,
that design process, and obviously it was an area that added value. And they've started to see, the benefits in other areas. Training for presentations and things like that can obviously be done in VR. So I
yep,
think I still speak to businesses that perhaps still see VR as a bit of a one-trick pony doing this thing around, visualization very well. And I think those other sectors need to step away a little bit from the complexities of the systems and the technology, because like any technology, the laptops or the smartphones that we use every day, under the covers, it's quite complicated, but it's a tool to do a variety of jobs, and that's the way I think businesses need to think about it. Maybe you start in one area, but then look at how that
yeah.
can be beneficial across the business, so it becomes a bit more of a widely deployed
Mm.
tool.
I think certainly in kind of some of the more enterprise level companies from the from the businesses we've spoken to, I think there seems to be not one kind of joined up way of kind of how companies are sorry, of how different departments, be that kind of marketing, design, and things like that, or maintenance, are kind of using VR. So everyone's kind of almost doing their own thing within those departments. So there's not that kind of shared learning happening, and it's quite disparate. Because you kind of would naturally expect, I guess, that big companies would kind of kind of almost have a much better defined structure when it is quite the opposite.
Yeah, I think sometimes big companies can be the opposite. They're more fragmented, and they can be. I've certainly spoken to companies where they've got different immersive tech projects running, and they
Mm.
don't know internally. We find out because we're supplying them, and we're sort of joining the
Yeah,
dots up internally. But I think yeah, joining forces in the businesses is definitely a way to help scale that as well. And
yeah,
I think if you're at some point with this tech, you've got to go up the ladder to get approval for expenditure on the hardware for deployment, through the CIO. And the more use cases you've got, I think the easier it is, to justify that within the business, and the more value, the more return on investment it can add.
yeah.
So.
So I guess kind of working in a fast-paced business like or the industries that you've been in, I guess that kind of over the years where they've been rapidly evolving. I guess it's kind of kind of leading in those kind of like fast-moving, innovative environments. I guess is never without its challenges. I mean, can you share a kind of leadership challenge you faced and how you kind of overcame it?
Yeah, I think, I've always been a believer. I think that, most challenges can be solved with a good team, with the right people, and empowering those people to do what they do best. There's an example of that I can give you, from relatively recent times in HTC. When we launched the Focus 3 in HTC back in 2021. It was a device that was, very well received by the market, but we were starting to see from the technical team a higher proportion of issues and new requirements coming in by one sector of users. But initially, we couldn't see, what that was, and see any trends, because we didn't have the data collected and presented in a clear way. And HTC runs a distribution model with its hardware, so we sell to distributors. So, sometimes you can be one step removed from the end customers. You're not getting perhaps the clear message. So after seeing this high rate of issues and new requirements, my engineering lead spent some time compiling the data, just connecting the dots on what different customers were asking for. And when she did that, it was very clear where that data was coming from. We saw a clear pattern from the location-based entertainment sector that were raising issues and feature requests. In the main, they were asking for things that the design of the Focus 3 product wasn't intended to do.
Yeah.
The next challenge was then, of course, to resolve these customer issues or add new features. You've got to get development resources, which in a fast-paced immersive tech environment can always be tricky. You're always looking at that trade-off from development resources. And in this case, it was even harder because each customer was relatively small in terms of demand. So again, it's back to the data. We worked with the sales team, we worked with those customers to compile that demand, and there was actually a lot of commonality in the features. So we're able to see that true demand both for my region in EMEA and also working with the other regions. So at that point, you've then got a much clearer combined set of data with a clear business plan and a much better idea of return on investment. And the end result of that was, within 3 to 6 months, within HTC, we saw the LB sector being, one of the major parts of our business, and it's an area that's still continued to grow both for HTC and outside of the business.
Yeah.
And I think those things, two things coming back to your original question. It's break it down into manageable chunks and stages. Big problems need breaking down, and spend that time up front doing the research, getting the data, preparing whatever's needed. That time up front can often be overlooked. So
Yeah. I mean, you kind of covered some of some of this ground, I guess, but how do you kind of ensure that ambitious ideas are translated into practical, real-world solutions that deliver impactful results?
yeah, I think for me, this has been an interesting challenge, moving a leadership challenge, as it were, moving into the
Sure.
XR immersive tech space, because there's a lot of creative people in this space for obvious reasons. It's a technology that was largely designed and used for visualization. And for me, the challenge is I'm an operations leader. I'm not the most creative person in the room. So sometimes you're having to tell those teams no, or to scale back their ideas on projects and ideas that may take a lot of time but don't have a certainty of success.
Sure.
So, but to come back to your question on translating those ideas to real world solutions, I think again, as I mentioned before, it's about putting that effort in up front, really understand the end goal and the ask behind the problem, whether that's from a customer or internally. And I don't mean, just ask on a surface level, really push, dig into what the customer wants, document those requirements, reflect it back to me. It's not very sexy stuff, but, if you frame the project well at the beginning, then it enables you to break it down a little bit more. You want to be spending that time up front, not later on in the project when you're building, coding, or even testing, because it's obviously much more costly then to go back. And I've got some examples of that as well I can share.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to kind of hear one or two of them then, I guess, in terms of where you've done that before.
Yeah, so I think one that comes to mind, and this was in the early days of the VIVERSE product at HTC, which is HTC's metaverse solution. We had a large customer project, and the customer was asking for a lot of new work and out of scope features that weren't in the original plan. And this was really the customer project team, so not the senior leaders that had been involved in the decision. So we sat down with them. We did the boring non-fun stuff of documenting the requirements, making clear on what they were expecting, and then in the nicest possible way, I set up a call both with the project team and their bosses. Essentially having to say, look, we can do these, but it is going to add time and in some cases cost to the original scope that, of course, he was signing the check for. And luckily for me, he got this immediately. He'd had these problems before where, from the customer side, they ended up customizing a product so much that it actually deviated from the original thing that they'd come to the supplier to purchase. So,
Right.
he was on board. He got the focus back to the core features. Of course, it needed to be branded and reflect them and what they wanted to do. But under the covers, it was getting back to the original product that they wanted, and that allowed us then to get on really with the work at hand. So again, it's that time up front and the not so sexy
Yeah.
stuff that sometimes I think not everybody wants to do.
Do you think it sometimes comes with its challenges to kind of manage, creatives and what, particularly like you say, kind of coming from other industry, the way you worked before, like IoT and telecoms into, into an industry like immersive tech, where you're kind of working with creatives that, kind of love the big picture, big idea and things like that. Kind of how do you, what kind of strategies have you learned, I guess, in your time in this marketplace to kind of align, the global teams while kind of perfectly balancing, I guess, that kind of creativity and innovation and to kind of keep things, kind of grounded, I guess, to a large extent.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think, as I say, working with the creatives is definitely one of the challenges for me personally,
Yeah,
because it can sometimes be a conflict. But I think for that strategy, it's a bit of a cliche, but for me, it's always the three C's: communicate, communicate, communicate,
yeah,
type of thing. So, when in earlier roles, when I was at BlackBerry, I was based out of our European headquarters, but I'm remote from the headquarters team. And I learned over many years, what it feels like to get these directions, these diktats, from headquarters to say, right, we're going to do this now, and there's perhaps no rationale. So you've got to, again, I'm fine with change, so you get around that. But if you haven't got the context, whether you're a leader or an individual in the organization, it's harder, I think, to adapt to anything new,
sure.
whether that's new work, change work, new leadership, what it is, having that rationale behind it. So that's always something I've tried to do with teams. Is not just explaining what we're going to do, but why, the
Sure.
rationale behind it. And the other thing I've learned is everybody adapts at a different rate. Some people get it quite quickly. Some people are nervous about change. So you have to spend that time communicating. It's not just a
Yeah.
case of sending an email to a global team and say, we're going to do this, or one quick group call to say, this is what we're going to do. It's
Yeah.
explaining the thinking behind it, explaining the goals, and just, making them feel part of the journey, I think
Yeah.
is really important.
Because I guess the thing is, that, I mean, I know it's a word that, it's quite a maligned, kind of word, but I guess it's that whole thing of empowerment as well, isn't it? I think when people kind of feel that, exactly as you say, that everybody knows what, general direction of travel. And I guess that, that everybody's on board and, sorry, I won't use too many cliches, but, but I guess, they're there for the journey, aren't they, really?
Yeah, exactly. So with the creatives, it's right. You can be as creative as you want, but we need to deliver the product by this date, or it needs to have these use cases. So it's got to have the creative element, it's got to have the practical element. So setting those goals and targets, even if they're not very detailed goals, but just a direction, and let the creative team find their path through that. I think that's the value of really explaining to people the rationale and what you're aiming to do with this.
Yeah. So kind of moving on to your time then, but, kind of most recently with VIVERSE, obviously you were involved with them at a very, very early stage of the, kind of platform, throughout to its, sorry, and then we're, throughout the kind of, to the global development stage as well. What's the kind of most unexpected challenge that you encountered while scaling, and into, and more so importantly, into new markets, and how did you approach it?
I think one of the things that surprised me a lot was setting customer expectations. And I've seen this especially with tenders around metaverse projects, and especially from the Middle East where there's funding and there's been a large number coming from. So
Yeah.
for an obvious reason, I don't want to, call out any customers, and it's not their fault. But sometimes you see this sort of laundry list of requirements. Some that would make sense in a virtual sense, and some that that frankly wouldn't add value in a digital space.
Yeah.
And it's like they've created this list of everything that they have heard VR can do without looking at the valuable use cases. Sometimes it's even things that it's even worse. It's things that VR can't do, but they've seen in the movies, kind of thing. So we had a customer that wanted to scan real world objects and bring them into the metaverse, and this wasn't for modeling or the design. It was, real world packages, parcels, and materials. So imagine an airport scanner when you're, going through
Yes.
an airport with a baggage control. And so we had to sort of sit down with them and say, we could do this, but why?
Yeah.
What's the use case behind it? What's the value that you intend? And I think, that's been a bit surprising. Sometimes the expectations are up here in
Yeah.
terms of what you can do with the technology, and it's evolving rapidly, but there's, it's still perhaps not as everybody would expect.
Sure.
And then you've also got to manage that. Well, don't just change everything you're doing because, you've got this funding or support. Look at where it adds the most value and do that first.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Do you tend to find a lot of the time then, I guess, with kind of new platforms like VIVERSE and things like that, that a large aspect of the role is kind of expectation management?
I think there's certainly a significant, element of it. I think that's been getting less and less so. In the 5+ years I've been in this space, and from the many years following it beforehand, I think that expectation management is getting less and less. I mean, look at
Right.
the videos we see of the metaverse experiences now versus those, even from a couple of years ago. You're seeing much richer environments, much more fluid movement. Avatars have legs and things like that. So, but I think there's always some degree of expectation setting at times. And I think,
Yeah.
again, to prove that value for businesses, it's better to start with something, very focused and small, and then, have that performing really well, and then roll out further and scale up beyond there, rather than try and, do everything at day one type of thing.
Yeah. And how do you, how do you kind of, I guess based on your experience, I mean, how have you kind of managed to maintain flexibility while staying focused on long-term goals, when scaling products or teams?
Yeah, so I think, when it comes to scaling products, firstly, I think a lot of it is, as I said earlier, it's breaking those down into smaller chunks, achievable goals, milestones in the projects. In software development terms, into, manageable sprints that can add beneficial features that are well tested at a steady pace to the system. One of the things
Yeah.
I've found, again, with metaverse solutions, there's a 1,001 things that you can do in these environments, but you have to keep that focus. So one of the things, we did last year was we really doubled down at HTC ViveVerse on some of our key USPs and really made sure that they were, very clearly messaged, very clearly demonstrated, working the best that they could, before you get distracted with lots of, shiny things over here. So keeping that focus there on products. When it comes to teams, I think, I've seen inexperienced leaders and businesses starting with grand plans to, ramp everything up. And this is a classic startup dilemma. You get some funding, you go out, you buy you get a great team on board. But, sometimes the people you need at one phase of a startup or scaling business are different than people you'll need later on.
Yeah.
So I think, and that investor money has to be spread across people, technology, lots of other areas of the businesses. So at times I've advised startups, not always to jump in to hire permanent roles, get advisors, consultants, fractional staff on board at that early stage, because you may find that you want to, you have a need to change the sort of people that you need. And good startups, really recognize this. They start up gradually. They do use that sort of fractional staff, and understand that sometimes that staff has to change. Your supply chain team in the design phase needs different skills than when you're in ramp up and volume production. Now, if you're a
Yeah.
big business, you can probably absorb having people with both of those skills.
Mm.
As a startup or a smaller business, you can find people, sure, with both of those skills, but do you really want to compromise in those key stages of your businesses? So I think
Sure.
it's about building that clear plan, again, breaking it up a little bit into stages of the business. Might be a little bit longer than a project. It might be the first 2 years that you're planning on what you need, but focus, very much on that from an execution perspective.
So from a kind of, based on your expertise and experience with VIVERSE, if you were assembling a team again for a, high impact kind of immersive tech kind of project or platform, what qualities or kind of expertise would you prioritize in the first instance?
Yeah, so I think it for different types of businesses or different types of scale, you'd look at, there's perhaps a couple of different methodologies you use. So if you were a startup scale up type business, as I mentioned, I think I'd look at, what I need over the first 1 to 2 years, really, build that team, not just within house staff but with advisors, build strong and fast to keep that momentum, with everybody clear on the goals for that first stage. So, whilst there is obviously a longer term strategic plan, it's making everybody clear on those tactical goals in the first 2 years.
Yeah.
If you're in a larger or even a smaller business that's a bit more established, I think you've got other factors to think about. And to me, recruiting has always been about how people fit into the team. And that's
Yeah.
not just about how people get on, it's about do they have complementary skills? Because you don't want a team of people that are all operational or all creative. You need that mixture so that people can learn. You can cover different areas of the business. Um, and as a leader, I think it's also important to have people that can challenge you. I mean, they disagree and argue with you all the time, but they come with different skills than you. Your role as a leader is not to know everything about their role and what they do.
Yeah.
You're bringing in their expertise, their different backgrounds and experiences, and that it's again another cliche, but it's greater than the sum of the parts. Then
Yeah.
when you build that team, so
Has there been any formulas that you've kind of adopted, I guess, when it comes to, I know it's obviously very dependent on the needs of the business at the time, but has there been any formulas where, that you've used before, I guess, to kind of know, where to prioritize, in like that initial hiring at the startup stage?
yeah, and not an exact formula. I think a lot of it is sort of living in the moment, as it were, and looking at what's needed on the ground. There's certainly a few lessons that I've learned harshly over the years. Tech sector has had layoffs wherever you are. And one of the
Mm.
things I learned back in the day with Ericsson was always expand behind the curve. It's great thinking, right, I've got 20 projects that are confirmed, but unless they're contracted, don't start recruiting those. Everybody now get started, get to a point where everybody's a little bit overloaded, and then bring people in. I think that
Sure.
also helps finding the right people, because then a much better idea of the skills you need, because we all
Mm.
think we can predict the future, but sometimes it's hard. And when you're actually in the depths of those projects, you may think you need a person with one type of skills, but actually maybe you need a little bit of other skills. So I think that's definitely one of the closest thing I could say to a strategy, is really look at
Yeah.
what you need at that point in time, and for the immediate future.
I think that's a really sensible approach. I mean, certainly based on what we've seen, in the industry and also within immersive tech over the last 18 months, I think that's been the biggest sea change, hasn't it? I think kind of before post-COVID, in the boom of, immersive tech, most companies were hiring in anticipation of growth. But when things kind of, I guess, stagnated a little bit, last year and even, yeah, I think that's companies then kind of almost changed their approach back again to almost waiting until they absolutely needed to hire, rather than kind of hoping that projects were coming in.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we had the famous, Meta Zuckerberg quote, back a couple of years ago, saying they needed 10,000 new staff for the metaverse, and then less than a year later, they're reducing headcount by a similar number. So I
Yeah.
think it's that not always slow and steady. Hopefully, you've got the projects in the pipeline to do that. But I think expanding behind the work is always how I would put it. Get everybody a little bit overloaded rather than having
Yeah.
people only underutilized. So
Yeah. So I mean, one of the kind of, I guess, kind of moving on to I guess one of the key subjects that everybody talks about around the immersive tech, and particularly in the, as you mentioned at the start of the piece, really around the advent of AI, is around that kind of whole governance and ethics. I mean, obviously privacy and ethical considerations are, major talking points. How do you think organizations can kind of build these principles into projects from the start?
yeah, it's an interesting area because one of the things I've noticed in this sector is we still have within businesses often a lot of specialist teams that are looking at those immersive tech projects. You've often, say, got a product manager or a group that's looking at sort of immersive tech. Now, I don't want to generalize too much, but it depends a
Mm.
lot in terms of how those teams are focused, where they're reporting to in the business, how they're incentivized, etc. If they're part of a CIO organization and plugged into the bigger picture, I think I've seen, they're asking the right questions at the beginning about those. But I've certainly seen a large number of projects in well established businesses that should know better. Where because the team's a little bit more isolated, it's just got this much more narrowed project of bring VR in. That they
Mm.
pick hardware and software solutions that are great in what they do and great for a proof of concept or a minimal viable product, but they're not scalable in those areas of security, privacy, and perspective. At some point, for those projects to scale up, you're going to have to go to the CIO of the business, and he's going to then start asking those questions about the security and privacy of the data. Because
Yeah.
I think people underestimate how much industrial espionage goes on. A few years ago,
Mm.
I was working for a small business, and people were trying to hack us. Every business has got valuable data, so if it's not just privacy of your customers' data, it's privacy of your roadmap and what you're doing that your competition want to have.
Yeah.
So again, it's definitely not the most exciting thing to do, and it definitely takes time out, but I do like it when a customer ask me as a supplier at the beginning of a project those privacy and security questions about how do you secure the data, what certification do you have, and things like that. And that's definitely one of the things I would advise. If you are one of those immersive tech teams, work elsewhere in the business, understand what they do for other IT equipment, and make sure you're asking those questions very early on
Yeah.
of suppliers.
Yeah. So obviously we kind of knew hardware come to market, and particularly around the kind of mixed reality and kind of AR wearable space. I mean, obviously there's now kind of massive amounts of concern, I guess, around things like kind of facial recording and things like that. And so with kind of user data and those aspects being such a critical issue, I mean, what steps do you think leaders can take to ensure it's handled responsibly and transparently?
Yeah, so I think the early answer covers some of that for sure, and I think on the customer side, as I say, I would definitely work with your CIO, CTO teams, your security teams very early on. It might be fine to make some exceptions for a POC, but if you're going to scale up, which is obviously the purpose of these projects, have a plan at day one to remove those risks before you scale up.
Yeah.
On the industry side, I think a lot of the industry has to focus not just on the flashy stuff, the visual, the core of immersive tech, and getting good PR and clicks, but has to do some of the more mundane fundamental things. And again, I'm generalizing a bit, but I've seen a lot more smaller businesses do this. So things like getting ISO certification for
Yeah.
security and privacy, training your teams across the business, regardless of where they work, but especially the development teams in those ISO standards in GDPR and data privacy. You've got to make it an
Mm.
essential part of your business. It's one of our strengths at HDC is that security and privacy. And if you're not just selling your product, you're selling your credentials in the tech space. So you have to reassure your customers that you're doing those things, and things like ISO is one way of doing that, and making it public.
Yeah. I mean, in your view, what role do you think senior leadership should play in creating a culture of accountability and trust within their kind of respective organizations?
Yeah, I think as with so many areas of leadership, I think it's about leading from the front and demonstrating this. We talked earlier about good communication, so it's
Yeah.
making sure from the top of the organization that that is a priority. No matter what you're doing, what the deadlines are that you need to ship, you've got to make sure that you've passed all those security and privacy checks. And that's sometimes sharing the bad news and the challenges as well. Get teams focused on learning lessons for those if there has been challenges, or if there's been customers that have been lost because you haven't met certain criteria. It's again about communicating with your team and experienced team members on that.
Yeah.
Um, So yeah,
Okay.
and I
So
think where errors do occur, it's important that the team know you've got their back, and
yeah.
we're all human. We can make mistakes. It's about learning from those. But yeah,
Yeah, definitely. So as we kind of look towards the future, then I mean, there's been some big announcements recently about kind of new hardware and operating systems. I mean, how do you kind of see this shaping up in the short term?
yeah. So I mean, I think we say this every year, don't we? But I think 2025 is going to be a year of significant change, and we've seen a lot happen, as you say, in 2024. It's really
Yeah.
set a foundation for this. We've seen Apple come into the market. We've seen more products from Meta with the Quest ES bringing down the price point, with the Meta Ray-Ban getting a lot more traction and really bringing AR to the forefront again, and continuing Meta's domination of the space at this stage. But as well as those, we've seen new hardware launches from Sony, HTC,
Yeah.
Pico, Pimax, pretty much everybody. I think I'm still working through all the announcements that have come from CES this week as well. So, but for me, I think going into 2025, the hardware is definitely interesting. But
Yeah.
to me, what I'm very interested in is how the operating system story is going to play out.
Yes.
So, as we said at the beginning, I'd been around long enough, in pre-smartphone days, and they were just phones. There was this fragmentation of software. Every manufacturer had its own user interface, its own operating system. That's largely speaking what we have in the XR sector today. It's somewhat fragmented. And if you look at mature products now, smartphones, PCs, we've really in both of those sectors got two dominant OSs. Of
Yeah.
course, there's some smaller ones, there's some exceptions for particular use cases, and those exceptions that prove the rule. So I think this fragmented market that we've got today in terms of operating system and user experience is going to change in the short term, over the next few years. I think we're going to see a three-way play ultimately on OSs, with Apple's entry into the space.
Yeah.
They're clearly going to continue their own OS. Meta had to make a bold move, I think, last year, to open source their OS and bring other manufacturers on there. And we've already seen the likes of Asus, Lenovo, and even Microsoft, starting to work with Horizon OS.
Mm.
And then finally, the announcement just before Christmas that we're actually going to see Android XR coming to market this year as
Yeah.
well. And I frankly see, based on the other sectors, that we're going to see in the next couple of years that if you're not running on one of those OSs, you're going to
Yeah.
be falling behind, because
Mm.
it takes a lot of money to develop hardware and OSs and user experience and keep up with new features. I think we're going to see more align with one of those
Yeah.
OSs.
I think it's certainly, I mean, I know it's kind of part of Apple's kind of traditional way of doing things, but I think it's certainly quite a bold move by Apple to kind of go it alone with their own operating system, like you say, particularly when, platform or companies like Meta, sorry, have kind of taken such a collaborative approach with kind of, open sourcing it, as you say.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think Meta weren't around really well. I mean, they were, but they were having different priorities at the start of the smartphone era, and that move from
Yeah.
Meta last year was absolutely what they needed to do to make sure that they're not just the hardware provider, that OS is benefiting much more. And they've got market leader advantage. So this time round it's Android XR that's actually going to be playing the catch up. So although I do think it's going to come out of the gate quite strong, they've been working on it for a number of years. What they first brought on, I mean, didn't stay that long, but Mark
Yeah.
Lukowski from Meta a couple of years ago. But they've clearly been working on it on the OS for about 4 or 5 years, and they've got the experience in that. So yeah.
If you're a gambling man, I guess over the next 5 years, who do you think will emerge as being the kind of leading player in that OS space out of the three companies, or we'll say out of three areas you mentioned?
I hope we're going to see three OSs. Working from BlackBerry, we always thought there was space in the market for more than two OSs. As I say, Apple's obviously going to continue on its own, so I think it will be a three-way play between those. But Meta have got the market leader advantage at the moment. But Android XR have obviously got Samsung on board. That's a big
Yes. Yeah.
powerhouse, tons of experience, in the space, and they've got a proven history in terms of rapid growth. So it's not just about the numbers; it's the quality as well of the partners that you've got on board. And for Android XR and Samsung, that's really an ideal partnership there as well to kick this off.
Yeah. I mean, it certainly seemed like quite a clever move by both kind of Google and Samsung to kind of partner on the next kind of hardware device that they're bringing out, because I know kind of Google have tried a few times before, haven't they? I think with Glass and things like that to kind of come by themselves, and I think it's never what's put it bluntly, I guess they've not really had any degree of success, but I think it was certainly interesting to see what the impact of Samsung will have on on the hardware play as well coming into the market.
Yeah, I mean, it's both parties doing what they do best.
Yes. Yeah.
At that initial stage, Samsung have got a lot of experience for hardware. Many of the screens that are used in the industry are from Samsung. Batteries, key components are from Samsung, so they can make that hardware at scale, at cost-effective levels. And Android, Google can focus on the OS. I think over
Yeah.
time, longer term, it will change. If there's the market there, you'll start to see the equivalent of, Pixel phones. But at this stage, I think it's absolutely the right thing for them to do.
Yeah. So if we jump to the time machine then and we kind of leap forward a decade, where do you kind of see immersive technology kind of impacting the most in terms of how we live and work?
Yeah, I think there's several areas that come to mind. I think firstly on the consumer and entertainment side that we haven't talked about too much today, I think we're going to see continued growth there. I mentioned location-based entertainment before. That was one of the mistakes I made, I think, a few years ago. I thought it had relatively limited demand. I don't think that demand is going to slow down. I think people are looking for new experiences. But I think beyond that, we're going to see in the consumer space, it's going to be much more common that we go to concerts and other experiences in VR. Meet the legends, meet the players from your favorite
Yeah.
football team or F1 stars in VR. So I think that opens up a lot of new areas, and we've seen some really interesting events in the past in Fortnite with Travis, with Engage, with Fatboy Slim, and I think we're going to be
Yeah.
seeing a lot more of those over the next decade, and it's going to become much more normal on the consumer side to enjoy events and other entertainment in that way, either from your home or even at shared experiences like
Sure.
location-based entertainment values.
It does definitely feel like, I think, that the missing piece at the moment is that consumer market, isn't it? I think the kind of industry or the kind of B2B market, sorry, seems to have kind of or seems to be embracing kind of immersive tech, where I think the B2C market is still, still seems to be kind of lagging behind a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, somewhat. And I guess inevitable with the way the economy has been more broadly recently, consumers are tightening their belts, so they need to look at that value. So they're looking for things that have got proven value.
Yeah.
But in an environment where people are cutting back on their Netflix and digital subscriptions, of course, they're perhaps going to be less interested in investing in consumer propositions. So it's you've got to have both. You've got to have the experiences there to drive users on board, and then the users are more likely to invest in that. So
Yeah, absolutely.
on the business side, there, I think just to complete that, I think we're going to see, as I touched on earlier, VR hardware be much more commonplace in businesses. I think you're going to see things like XR training rooms there, so you can have wide area training where people can move around a bit more freely. But I also think a lot more people will have a VR headset at their desk. In my view, we're not going to spend our entire day in a
Sure.
VR headset, but I think it will be much more natural for certain tasks to pick up the VR headset, join a meeting, review a product in VR. I think with advances of hardware making it easier to do that, I think that will become much more ubiquitous. So it'll be like another piece of hardware: laptop, smartphone, and XR headset on your desk.
I remember reading an article last year, I think, where, and I think just as Vision Pro came out, I think Tim Cook was kind of prophesizing at the time. I think that mobile phones would be obsolete in the next kind of 5 to 10 years, and everything I just recall it will be obsolete wearables, and there've been a kind of other devices beyond that.
Yeah, and I think that's quite interesting on the hardware perspective, particularly on the AR front. I don't think we're very far away now from, consumers, wearing AR glasses a lot more of the time, and using the sort of use cases that we use today. I'm great with remembering faces, but horrible with remembering names. So just having that prompt of who you're speaking to at an event and things like that, and giving people directions, the use cases that already exist. And I think we're going to see, I think my analogy is perhaps more like the smart watches rather than the
Yes.
smartphone, because I think,
Yeah.
smartphone, you can't leave home without it. I think with smartwatch, a lot of people are addicted to theirs, but it's not as essential. I think that's more the analogy that I would make. But
Sure.
I think it is going to be much more common to leave home, to have your AR glasses for those use cases, and it becomes, a very valuable add-on.
Mm.
Yeah,
Yeah, well, I went to a presentation of a lady that was talking who was like Samsung, and I think they how they kind of deem the success of any hardware would be that it was intrinsic as your mobile phone. That that
yeah,
if you had a mixed reality or kind of AR device or or anything like that, that how far away would you be from home before you go back and pick it up? So it was
yeah,
as important as your mobile phone.
yeah, yeah. That's right. Yeah, and if you're
Yeah.
AR gives you that because it's only going to come to the forefront when you need it, when you need directions, or when
Mm.
you're interrogating it with AI to give you the information you need.
Yeah.
So it becomes like the watch, that it's there and then it does certain things, and you're reviewing that and can look back at the end of the day.
Yeah. Totally. So, again, kind of based on your expertise, but I mean, if you could introduce a completely new immersive tech application to them, to the world, what would it be and why?
I think the first one actually is on that hardware. If I could wave a magic wand, I think I'd love to get rid of, and I think this is going to happen fairly soon. It's only in that 10-year time frame.
Yeah.
I think with hardware advances, we've got to move away from that VR, MR, AR categories. That's confused users and has slowed adoption over the years while people wait and see. And I think, from what I'm seeing on some of the AR demos at the moment, we're not that far away from AR glasses with the addition of a simple frame or a gasket will convert it into lightweight VR when you need to escape the real world fully. So then you've got, one form factor. Um, on the application side, it's a bit more of a personal one, but I'm a golfer, so if I could wave a magic wand and have any application, it would be Zaphod Beeblebrox type AR glasses that when I'm playing over water or another hazard would just, show me a nice green
Yes.
fairway in front. But joking aside, I think, those creative teams, as hardware becomes deployed more and becomes more common, you get more and more use cases. Look how smartphones started. They started for voice calls. Now we use them for everything else but voice calls, pretty
Totally.
much.
Yeah.
So, and I think we're going to see, lots more use cases as there's more users. So,
Yeah. So, John, to wrap things up, I think let's do a quick fire round. Short questions, quick answers. And we touched on it before around the kind of AI piece. But I mean, how do you see AI shaping the next generation of XR experiences?
yeah, so AI and XR absolutely go hand in hand. The Gartner hype cycle and the press cycle of people believing XR is dead because AI has taken over is a gross implication. AI, does have much more uses beyond XR, but I think AI in immersive tech helps those XR environments scale. It removes many of the UI problems. We've seen a 3 billion investment this morning in a metaverse, or
Yeah.
yesterday I think it was, in a metaverse and an AI business. So I think that's that's proving that point really.
Yeah. What's one way immersive tech could contribute to tackling global challenges like sustainability?
Yeah, so I think with systems today, it's already possible to increase that human connection with people and reduce flying and travel time, which we're all
Mm.
trying to do at the moment. So that's always good for the environment. The technology isn't deployed enough, and the hardware factors and software OS factors that we talked about, and just the growth in the sector, I think will start to change that this year. Especially as hardware size starts to come down. And then I've also been speaking to somebody recently that is looking at integrating IoT data with 3D modeling for flooding to look at things like flood prevention, disaster recovery. And I think that's an interesting area to explore a little bit more, bringing in that additional data and modeling capabilities that AI can bring.
Yeah. So, and if you could change one thing about the industry today, what would it be?
I think hopefully this investment yesterday, shows some signs of changes for that. But I think the one thing would be not to expect profits and projects to make a profit in 1 to 2 years. Give things a little bit longer. This is investment for growth. We talked about the smartphone sector quite a bit today.
Yeah.
That was several decades really of heavy investment in building out networks, technology, before it became the money making machine that it is. So I think just allowing a little bit more time for these projects to really take hold. And it's not that they aren't growing or won't be profitable, but I think it's going to take a little bit more time before we see the real value returned on those. That's why Meta are investing 3 billion or more every quarter and have been for
Yeah.
several years. So
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, that concludes our quick fire round. Thank you for that.
thank you.
I understand you've kind of recently left HTC. What's next for you as you kind of look towards the future?
Yeah, so I'm working on some solo projects. I want to help businesses move forward with immersive tech, and help them navigate through some of the challenges that we've talked about today in an efficient manner. And some areas that are pretty close to my heart. I'm working with some partners that are focused on not-for-profit, charity, social good projects. So I'll give them a quick shout out, and if people have got any interest in these, they can contact me. So
Yeah.
mentioned it earlier, the Elder Metaverse, reducing social isolation. So if there's people that are care homes or interested in hearing more about this, drop me a line. At the other end of the age spectrum, a partner look at connecting teenagers with therapists, which I think is an amazing idea, and I've talked
Yeah.
about at events in the past. So they're looking for support and funding and getting to a minimum viable product. So if anybody's interested in that. And then there's a couple of academic projects, one to do with insects in VR. So if there's any budding
Interesting.
entomologists, I think is the right term, then that are interested in VR, then let me know. And the other one I mentioned earlier was 3D modeling. So those are some areas that at the moment, but more broadly, if people want to explore a little bit more, we can have a chat and see if I or the other people that are behind me and they're connected with can help them on their projects. So I think this is a really good year for XR, and I want to play my role in helping things move forward.
That sounds amazing, though, what you're doing. Yeah, congratulations on that, and all the best with it. Thank you very much for joining me today, John. For sharing your journey and I guess kind of your insights into what your kind of predictions, I guess, on the future of immersive tech. For our audience, if they kind of want to contact you or kind of connect with you, what's the best route for them to reach out to you?
Yeah, best thing to do is I'm on LinkedIn. I'm very visible on LinkedIn, hopefully. So John Dabill. Luckily, the advantage of having an unusual surname is it's very easy to find me. So reach out to me on LinkedIn, and then we'll pick up connections on that. So.
Lovely. Well, thanks again, John, and thank you everyone for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe to Immersive Futures, perspectives for more conversations with people driving the future of immersive tech, and we'll catch you next time. Thank you very much.